I'm going to record. You'll probably get a prompt. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jessica Lawson, and I work in the Community Relations Department at Peace River Center. We are so glad that you're joining us today for this webinar. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat or the Q&A. A lot of the questions Donna will probably answer as she goes along. So if there are any at the end, we'll definitely get to those. We can also follow up with you via email. If you do have to leave early, we will send a recording of this, so feel free to do that. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Donna. She is a licensed mental health counselor and master's certified addiction professional. She's worked at Peace River Center for more than 30 years in several different departments, including victim services, case management, children's advocacy center, children's therapist, assertive community treatment, addiction services, family intensive treatment, forensics, and the Children's Action Team. Donna currently holds the position of Director of Specialty Services at Peace River Center. She is trained and certified in various evidence-based therapy techniques and serves as a consultant and trainer for those becoming certified in eye movement and desensitization reprocessing, EMDR therapy. She is also a mental health first aid trainer for the community. So without further ado, Donna, I will let you go ahead and take over.
Okay, thank you. Well, today we're going to talk about how the brain processes information, specifically when it deals with trauma, as well as we're going to go into EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, what it is, how it works, why it works, and how to get involved with that. So hopefully I'll have some new information for you if you're a survivor of trauma and is just interested in EMDR therapy or how trauma affects the brain, or if you're a therapist in the field and want to find out more information about this type of therapy technique. But over the past couple of decades, there has been just an explosion of research in this area. And if you have never heard of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, I would highly recommend that you get it, whether you're in the field or if you're someone seeking therapy for trauma. It's an excellent book, has a lot of great information in it. And in that book, it really bases it into three new branches of science that has come out over the last couple of decades. Neuroscience, which is the study of how the brain processes information, developmental psychopathology, which is the study of adverse childhood experiences and the impact it has on the developing brain. The famous ACE study, if you haven't heard of that, adverse childhood experience study that came out years ago. That's another thing I would suggest that you look up. Some wonderful information has come out of that on how the brain processes trauma. And then the interpersonal neurobiology, which is the study of how our behavior affects our thoughts and our emotions. But also, in this book, he doesn't refer to it specifically, but it addresses it, certainly, is somatic psychology. And that's what we're talking about today, is the study of the interaction between the brain and our behaviors and our actions and how it affects our psychological and our physical health. So let's just dive right in. Why all of this research? Why is it such a big topic over the last couple of decades? Well, the United States is one of the most traumatized countries in the world. That probably doesn't surprise you. 89% of people in the United States report that they've had at least one traumatic experience in their life, and most adults have experienced more than one traumatic event. Life happens. Trauma is just a part of life. But keep in mind that it's not so much the traumatic event that is so distressing, but it's those memories that we carry with us that are so distressing. So what does a memory involve? Well, a memory involves all of our senses. It involves images, sounds, smells, taste, touch. All of that is part of a memory, as well as our emotions, our bodily sensations, and the beliefs that we hold. Everything that happens to us in life, we develop either a belief or a perception about the experience. And that's going to play a very important part in the EMDR that we're going to talk about a little bit later. It's going to become very important how our belief systems interact with all of the rest of the memory. So what happens in the brain when we formulate these memories? An event occurs, your brain is taking in all this sensory information that's associated with the event. And the amygdala, which is right down here in the brain stem, assigns how much emotional significance that event is going to have. Our frontal lobe, which is located here, locks in on that target, and it just begins to categorize all of this sensory information that it's taking in. Once it's categorized and stored in the hippocampus, whenever the person encounters anything in their environment that reminds them of that memory is pulled up out of the hippocampus into that working memory. The new information is added and then it's restored. And that's the place where we can do trauma kind of work. The EMDR is really based into that, how that whole process works. So we're going to look at that in more detail as we go along throughout. So what impact does trauma have on our brain? Well, when a traumatic experience occurs, our brain just stops processing in a normal way. And it leaves us with just fragments of what happened when it's immediately right after the event. If you've ever watched any show on television that has to do with law and order, there's lots of different police shows on TV anymore. You'll notice right after the crime occurs, they'll interview the suspect or the victims, and they'll tell their story. And then days or maybe weeks later, all of a sudden now the person has more information that they're adding, and it appears as if they've changed their story. When what they don't realize is that immediately after a trauma happens, it's very common to only be able to verbalize pieces and fragments of what actually happened. That's not the best time to interview somebody. Unfortunately, for law enforcement, that's how it has to happen. But that's what's going to happen is you're going to find that when they come in for counseling, it's going to be hard. The closer it is to the event, to piece together all the pieces and to be able to verbalize that. And we're going to see why. One of the reasons why is right after a trauma, our ability to manage our range of emotions is decreased. And that's why a lot of times right after a trauma, a person will almost be blunted. And it's almost as if the event wasn't as traumatizing as what we think it should be to the person, but that's because they have that blunted affect. And that's all part of the brain shutting down and not processing the event fully at that time. So why does that happen? Well, the brain has three parts. You have your reptilian brain, which is this part right down here. That's where the survival mode kicks in, that fight or flight. The autonomic body responses kick in there. You have your midbrain, which controls all the emotions. And then you have your thinking center, which is in the frontal cortex there. So when a trauma happens, that reptilian brain, that fight or flight response is what kicks in. And after the immediate threat is over, then the brain starts to go into a restorative mode. However, in about 20% of cases in people who've experienced trauma, that shift never occurs. And that's why you get all of these symptoms that are associated with things like PTSD. So what's happening in the brain during that time? Well, that prefrontal cortex deactivates. And that's why, you only have pieces of what happened. You kind of get trapped in that moment, because that thinking center is underactivated. Same thing with that emotional part, that midbrain. The amygdala is not able to tell between past and present. That's why some people who have a diagnosis of PTSD have a hard time distinguishing between that. They'll hear something or see something that reminds them of that memory, and it'll feel like to them like it's happening all over again. You'll hear that if you're a therapist and have people coming into your office due to a traumatic event, you'll hear that quite often is they feel like they'll encounter something in their environment that reminds them of the trauma, and they'll say, it feels like it's happening all over again to me. That's very, very common. And the fear center becomes overactivated. So they're not able to determine whether a situation is safe or not. They become confused in that area. And the result is a whole myriad of symptoms that can happen. What you see on your screen right now is just a small sample of some of the more common symptoms that you might see from someone who's experienced trauma, especially repeated trauma, or have a diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So what have we learned about trauma and the interactions with the brain? Well, we know that anybody who's experienced trauma, especially if it's repeated trauma, it leaves an imprint on our brain so that we're not able to think clearly. They have problems learning from their past experiences. You'll see that a lot, especially with individuals who have found themselves in abusive relationships. If you've known anybody that's been in an abusive relationship, they tend to go from one abusive relationship to the next. And that's because they have trouble learning from their past experiences. They also have trouble determining what's safe and not safe. And as a result, they superimpose their trauma on everything around them. Everything seems dangerous. They become very hypervigilant, and every situation seems a danger to them. They feel threatened most of the time. Why is that? That's because traumatized people keep secreting large amounts of the stress hormone even after the actual danger is already over and it no longer exist. That survival brain just keeps secreting and secreting stress hormones. So that obviously is going to have an impact on our physiological health, our emotional health. A lot of what we know about human behavior, we learn from animals. And that's the same thing with that toxic stress levels. This is an example from a salmon. Salmon, if you know anything about salmon, they always return every year to their breeding ground. And that may involve traveling for up to as long as 9 months at a time, hundreds of miles at a time, upstream, up against the current, and they return to their breeding ground. And going against the stream like that, and what it takes to arrive to their breeding ground is so stressful, and that stress hormone just keeps releasing, that they don't even eat during that trek because they're saving their energy until they get there. That poor little salmon, he even looks like he has a sad face there on his face, looks stressed out to me. So once they arrive to their breeding ground, then they lay their eggs, but they are so stressed out, and that stress level is so high from the stress hormones that they die soon after they've laid their eggs. And it's due to that toxic stress level. Eventually it kills them. And that's the same in humans, is that it has an impact emotionally and psychologically on the body when our stress levels are so high. But remember what happens in the brain. When a person undergoes a trauma, you have your right hemisphere that of the brain that controls the emotional part, that becomes overactivated. So that's where you get all that high level of emotion. The right hemisphere of the brain is the first one to develop. You have your nonverbal communication, your senses, sound, smell, taste. People overreact to voice, facial features, gestures, places. And it's that side of the brain that reacts as if the traumatic event is happening in the present, whenever they're encounter something that reminds them of the traumatic experience. But remember what happens on the left side of the brain. That's our logical side of the brain, where the language is located. That shuts down. And so a lot of times it is not even aware that they're re-experiencing or reenacting the past. So there's three major types of trauma. You have your childhood adverse events, developmental trauma, and that's where that ACE study came out of that we mentioned earlier. You have what we call shock trauma, which is a sudden, unexpected event. That could be like a hurricane or a tornado or car accidents, a one-time event. It could be something personal, a personal attack of one kind. And then you have your lifelong, your chronic stress, relational types of trauma. So if a person has experienced one type of trauma, then their risk increases to experience one of the other types of trauma. And if you've had at least two types of trauma, that highly increases your risk of developing something such as PTSD or a lifelong chronic impact from the trauma that you've experienced. And over time, when you have repeated traumas over and over, those similar experiences form together in what we call a dysfunctional memory network. So an individual is exposed to a very stressful event or a traumatic event, and everything that happens to us in life, we develop a belief or a perception about that experience. If it was a negative event, more than likely, it's going to be a negative self-belief that develops. We as humans tend to turn inward onto ourselves whenever something happens, and especially if it's a young child. You know, so many times when something traumatic happens to a child, they develop a belief that it was due to their fault. It's something, they were bad, something that they did caused it to happen. That happens a lot of time. These negative beliefs that we, and perceptions that we develop at the time of a trauma and then are carried forward with us into our adulthood. And unless you have some type of intervention or therapy to address that, we continue to carry that throughout our lifetime. And a repeated one, there's repeated negative beliefs and negative cognitions direct our choices and our behaviors and in our present situation. So everything that happens to us, whether it's positive or negative, like I said, we have a perception or a belief about what happened. And whether it's positive or negative, really, there's a difference in how those thoughts are organized in the brain. There's a difference in how we react to them. So I want you to do a little experiment with me. I want you to think of something positive, just very briefly, of something positive that's happened to you in your life. It could be a marriage, a birth of a child, a graduation, some special award, just very briefly. Think about that for a moment. And what I want you to do is think about what stands out about that memory for you. And so feel free to unmute yourself or put it in chat. And you could share with me, Jessica, anything in chat. What stood out for you about that positive memory? And now what I want you to do is I want you to think about a negative memory, nothing really huge. I don't want you to go away from this webinar feeling worse than what you did when you came. So, but just briefly, think about something negative that happened and what stood out about that memory for you.
We have a positive one, Donna. The birth of my son, she said, which was a lot of happiness.
Okay.
And then the loss of my brother, which was horrific pain.
Okay, so with traumatic memories, what tends to stand out the most are those sensory kinds of things, the images, the sounds, the bodily sensations, the emotions. Say in this, let's take the example here, you know, in a marriage, when people are getting married, probably when you think back to your wedding day, you're focusing on your spouse, what that was like to become married to your spouse, the different joy that the day brought, but you're probably not thinking about all the background noise. If it looks like this wedding may have taken place outside, there could be traffic, there could be birds in the background, there could be There could have been a tractor going past, but you probably wouldn't remember those types of things. Those are not what would stand out for you. But in a negative memory, so many times as a coping mechanism, the brain focuses in on something in the background, and it could be a sound or it could be a negative bodily sensation that's taking place. So we process positive and negative experiences different. But the one thing I want you to take away from today and remember is that trauma is not in the event itself, but in the experience of the event. That's what causes the distress if it's a traumatic event. And when we have future events that are similar, they start reinforcing that belief that we developed, whether it's a negative belief or whether it's a positive belief. And what happens then in the brain is it looks very much like this. We call that neuroplasticity or neurogenesis. And you may have heard the phrase, neurons that fire together wire together. Because over time, as experiences are repeated that reinforce that belief, especially if it was a negative belief, then what happens is that system grows and grows. And it can turn into either a negative neural network or a positive neural network, depending on whether it was a positive or a negative experience for you. And this is kind of what it looks like in the brain. Here you have something happen. You have a thought or a belief associated with it. Then something else happens later on that reinforces that. And that whole network grows. And with each experience that is similar and reinforces that belief system, it gets bigger and bigger every time it's repeated. And over time, the brain starts to anticipate what's going to happen. If it's a very negative belief, a lot of bodily sensations and emotions that will go along with that. And so as the event is occurring, and in the past, it's caused you to believe a certain thing about yourself that caused you to have an upset stomach, the brain starts anticipating that, and you get the upset stomach before you reach that point. It sees it coming ahead of time. And that's what happens when you get deja vu. The brain actually speeds up and anticipates what's coming. In school, you may have learned about Pavlov's dog, that experiment where they rang a bell and they'd feed the dog right after they rang the bell. And the dogs came to associate the sound of the bell with food. And they saw that they would ring the bell, the body would start reacting. The dogs would start salivating even before they put the food out. And that's because the brain was anticipating that that was going to be happening. And so that's how neural networks and neuroplasticity happens in the brain. So neuroplasticity can happen from either positive repeated events or negative repeated events. It can be from traumatic events, or it can be from positive things like social interactions or meditation or learning experience. So saying that, is neuroplasticity helpful or is it harmful? All that means is that your brain is always learning, always resilient. And so you can learn new ways of being and responding. And so anything that's repeated, whether it's helpful or unhelpful, is learned behavior. You learn actions and habits. And so what that tells us then is anything can be unlearned, right? So you can overcome depression, trauma, maladaptive patterns, thought patterns. But if it's untreated and you don't address it, it can also enhance depression, anxiety, or overreactive types of patterns. So it can be both helpful or harmful, depending on whether you're getting the help that you need or if you're ignoring it and continuing with those negative coping skills. Another thing that we learned, another branch of science that's come out is epigenetics. And that says that anytime that there's trauma, it leaves a chemical mark in our genes that can be carried for up to 3 generations. Now that really impacted me. I know when I've learned about this. This came out of a study out in California in 2018 where they took Civil War prisoners and they studied their children. And they found that their children tend to die at about 10% sooner than their peers, whose parents were not Civil War prisoners. So they started looking at that and trying to decide what did they have in common. And a lot of them, what they had in common was a lot of somatic kinds of conditions that involve the immune system. Their immune systems tended to be compromised. And so when you think about that, not only are we carrying our own stress around with us, but the stress of up to 3 generations past. And so over time, then that's more and more, it has a multiplying effect. And so think about that, that's why there's so much more of the fibromyalgia and cardiovascular disease and insulin resistance now than there was in the past because of the level of stress hormone that's in our bodies for generations. So what can we do about it? What kinds of consequences does that stress hormone have? Well, we know that people with a high level of stress hormones in their body are more likely to behave in ways that they wouldn't ordinarily behave. It goes against their morals, it goes against their values. They're more likely to go into that freeze mode. They're more likely to engage in what we call faulty neuroception. And that's where you're not able to determine whether a situation is safe or not. You may see a situation as dangerous by being hypervigilant when there really isn't any danger there. Or on the other end, you could fail to see the danger when there really is danger, like you would see in individuals who go from one abusive relationship to another because they're failing to see the danger that's involved. And they're more likely to engage in negative types of coping strategies. So when a person comes into counseling, one of the counselor's job is to keep their client in that optimal level of functioning, in their what we call the window of tolerance. That's when they're most engaged with us, they're alert, they're able to think clearly, they feel safe and calm. When a person is confronted with a traumatic memory, a lot of times they'll go into what we call an hyper-aroused state or a hypo-aroused state. A hyper-aroused state is that flight or fight response kicks in. They become very emotional. Their palms might get sweaty, their heart rate increases. They could go into a panic state, or they could go into a rage state. They're very hypervigilant, or they might react in the opposite way and go into a hypo-aroused state where that freeze response kicks in and they just become blunted. They're not able to react. They zone out or dissociate or shut down. And that's why a lot of times talk therapy hasn't really worked in the past. Traditional talk therapies haven't been as effective with working with people with trauma. So let's think about that. Why is that? What did we say about the brain on the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain? Somebody who's experienced trauma, they come in, they start talking about it. That memory of that traumatic event, they're confronted with it. What happens to that right side of the brain? Anybody remember? The right side of the brain deals with emotions and the nonverbal. So that gets overly activated, right? So they become very emotional. But at the same time, then what happens with the left side of the brain? It shuts down. That's our language. So here now you have a very emotional reactive person, but they're not able to verbalize what it is that they're going through. And that's why some people can be in talk therapy for a traumatic event for months or maybe even years and not get a lot of headway because they're just not able to verbalize their traumatic experience to the counselor, sometimes for years. So what happens in those situations is a lot of guilt, a lot of self-criticisms. Usually they'll end up dropping out of therapy. So when they first come into our counseling office, a lot of times they're misdiagnosed, people who have a severe traumatic history. So if you don't cover that very well, and when you're doing your history taking with your what we call biopsychosocial, a person could get misdiagnosed. If the provider's really focusing on the mood swings, that the client is complaining of their moods going up and down, they may be diagnosed with a bipolar disorder. If they're concentrating on the depressive type of symptoms that the client is verbalizing, they may give them a diagnosis of major depression. If they're focusing on that restlessness or fidgeting, their inability to attend to things, to keep their attention, they may give them a diagnosis of ADHD. If it's a young child and they're focusing on how they're responding with maybe temper tantrums, they may give them a diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder or oppositional defiance disorder. Now, any of those diagnoses may be correct. However, it doesn't describe where the client is or why the client is suffering the way that they're suffering, or exactly what type of client that the treatment needs. And so the therapy that I'm going to talk to you today about deals with is a very effective one for individuals who've experienced trauma. Eye movement desensitization reprocessing is just one type of trauma therapy. There are lots of various other ones. Just EMDR is the one that seems to be generating a lot of interest right now. It's one that I'm highly trained in, one that I've used frequently. So that's the one I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. And it's based in several tenets. One, all of us have both positive and we have negative experiences in life, right? And our past experiences influence what's happening to us in the present. Everybody, I think, would agree with that. And like I said before, everything that happens to us in life, we develop a belief or perception about that experience. And if it's something that was traumatic, most of the time that belief is something negative that we've turned inward on ourselves. But the hope is that neurological plasticity, the brain's ability to change and update that negative neural network throughout one's lifetime into more adaptive learning. And that's the basis of EMDR therapy. So what we do when we're doing trauma work with individuals is we're helping the client to take those negative belief systems and focus more on adaptive beliefs that would go with it. So how do we do that? We keep what is helpful, we discard what's no longer needed, and prepare for the next occurrence. When I say prepare for the next occurrence, the next time that they're going to encounter something in their environment that's going to remind them of that past event. And once we do this in a repetitive way throughout the therapy process, then that negative neural network starts to become more adaptive into an adaptive neural network. And that's going to facilitate recovery. So the survival brain can learn that, okay, now this is safe. This is a safe environment that happened in the past. the threat is over, and they no longer have to feel helpless. And that's when recovery can start to happen. So what are the goals of trauma therapy? Of course, to eliminate those symptoms. So many times people who have experienced trauma, especially if it's a repeated trauma that's happened over and over in their life, they may have symptoms such as nightmares, flashbacks, a startle reflex. And we want to eliminate as many of those as we can, change the focus from the past event into the present. So we want to bring them out of that past and more into the present, get them looking more into how that's affecting them in the present, improve their daily functioning, help them regain that sense of power, gain some coping skills that they can move forward with in their life, a sense of safety, improving their future outcomes, and changing those negative beliefs into more positive beliefs. So is EMDR evidence-based? And yes, it is, but what does that mean? What does evidence-based treatment mean? Well, it means that there's a lot of research that's out there that's on it, but not only is there a lot of research, but the research has shown that whatever it is that you're studying, that it's effective for what you're trying to treat. So EMDR therapy has been one of the most researched types of therapy that's out there, more than all the other types of therapy put together. There's been a lot of research on it over the since about the 80s. And many different organizations that participate in different types of research has shown that it is an effective form of treatment for trauma, not only here in the United States, but internationally. And you can see here several different agencies that have researched it and found it to be effective. But why was something else needed? I know when I've had a bad day, I always feel better if I'm able to vent to a friend or my spouse when I go home. And lots of times talking about a situation is helpful. However, talking about a traumatic event isn't going to stop the flashbacks, isn't going to improve your concentration, isn't going to improve your relationships in life, isn't going to stop that hypersensitivity. So we needed to find a form of treatment that can help eliminate a lot of those types of symptoms. So what is EMDR? How does it work? It's a form of therapy used to heal from trauma or distressing life events. It's, like I said, it's been very extensively researched, but it uses rapid sets of either eye movements or other forms of bilateral movement. You see on the screen there, you'll see a picture of me with my fingers, up. The therapist may go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth with their fingers and have the client follow their fingers with their eyes without moving their head. So their eyes are moving right to left, right to left, right to left. Or they might have them do tapping, right, left, right, left, right, left, types of tapping. But what that does is it's replicating REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. That's the body's natural way of processing stress that you've had throughout the day. So you're tapping into a very natural process in the brain, which is why I think one of the reasons why it's so effective is you're using a scientific method to treat the trauma as opposed to a totally subjective one that traditional types of talk therapy would do. So you're helping them process a traumatic event in a more adaptive way and ending up with a more adaptive resolution. So how did this start? How was this even discovered? The founder of EMDR therapy, Francine Shapiro, I'm not sure if she ran or if she was a walker or a runner, but every day she would go out and exercise, whether she was walking or running. And as is common with us, when you're by yourself, and that's when we tend to ruminate over things that's bothering us. And while she was out for her daily exercise, she was ruminating about something that was bothering her. And she noticed that as she was doing so, her eyes were moving back and forth, back and forth. And she noticed that after her eyes did that movement, like we do in, like I said, in REM sleep, that she felt better about the situation, and it kind of intrigued her. And so she decided to do some research in that area. And so she was working at a veterans, a place for where veterans go for treatment at the time. And so that was her study group. It was in the 80s when soldiers were coming back from Afghanistan with combat-related trauma. A lot of them with PTSD, having nightmares and flashbacks, and not doing quite very well at the time. And so that was her study group. And she used this bilateral movement as they were processing their memories of being out there on the battlefield. And what she noticed is that it worked so well that they started using it with other issues. They said, let's try it with addictions or phobias or depressions. And they found that this type of therapy tended to work well for just about any kind of issue that was involved distressing memories of any kind. And since then, now you can find EMDR therapy in almost every country across the world. So how does it work? Well, the therapist will have the client think of the traumatic event, but they're going to ask them some other kinds of questions. They're going to ask them, what negative belief do you have about yourself when you think about that event? They're also going to ask them, what positive belief would you rather have? They're going to ask them about any feelings or emotions that's coming up, any sensations in the body that comes up. And then they're going to do bilateral stimulation. They're going to have the client engage in some type of bilateral movement, whether it's their eyes following the therapist fingers back and forth, or they might be tapping on their shoulders one at a time, or on their legs. But it's that type of bilateral kind of movement while they're thinking of the negative event. They're going to ask them some questions throughout. They'll stop, they'll do the bilateral movements for a little bit, and then they're going to ask them, what did you notice? Now, when they're engaging in that, this is what's happening in the brain. When they have them think of the negative event, that's going to come up. Anytime you think of a memory, that's going to come up in your frontal cortex. That's where processing in the brain begins, is in that frontal cortex. Anytime you think of anything, a memory comes up, this is where it's going to go, and that's where the processing starts. So when a person is in a traumatic event, and the brain is taking in all this sensory information, and that processing starts, under trauma, when the stress hormone is being released, it kind of speeds that whole process up, and that processing goes very, very fast, and it doesn't get stored in the hippocampus the way it should, so that the brain, remember, it's hard to tell past from present when it doesn't get stored correctly. And so what you want to do is to have them go through and think through the memory again while you're stimulating the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. So the synapses in the brain start firing, and then it follows that path again at a slower rate, slowing it down so that it gets stored correctly. By asking questions, by doing the bilaterals, you're getting it moving. By stopping and asking the questions about what has come up, what did you notice now? They also have them rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. How distressing is this for you now? They ask them that at the beginning, and then they ask them throughout the process to rate it. When you're rating it, you're bringing that left brain, that left hemisphere online. That's a logical task that you're asking them to do. So you have the emotional side come up when you bring up the memory, and now you're bringing the left side online so that the two hemispheres of the brain can communicate with each other. So now you're thinking about the event, but now that left side of the brain that during the trauma shut down and wasn't able to analyze and make meaning out of what was happening, the experience that was happening, now it's online and can analyze what happened, the whole experience. And what tends to happen when you do that with the client is all these insights start to come up. So that relearning can take place. You'll hear such things as, my parent really didn't have good parenting skills. And I know that she had an alcoholic father. My mom had an alcoholic father. So she was probably just repeating the same kinds of parenting that she saw in her childhood. And she just didn't have good parenting skills. So now you see the perspective has changed. Instead of turning it inward, I'm bad, I caused this, I'm unlovable, as a child experiencing that they carried forward, that thought and belief that they carried forward into adulthood. Now they're looking at it with a different perspective and thinking, my parents just didn't have good parenting skills. They didn't have good examples as a child. So now it's been brought up to their conscious level. They're disputing within themselves that irrational negative belief. And so that's one thing I love about EMDR therapy is the client actually becomes their own therapist. They're coming up with these insights on their own. You're just guiding them through that process. And once that belief system changes from that self-talk that they're doing through the EMDR therapy, all those symptoms that are related to the PTSD, the nightmares, the startle reflex, they disappear. So it's very exciting for me to see that happen right there before your eyes, because therapists don't always get to see the end result. People come in for therapy, they get it resolved, they leave therapy, and you don't really get to see how much of an impact it made in their life. But during EMDR therapy, you're actually watching the light bulb go off. And so it's exciting for the therapist, it's exciting for the client. So how long is a treatment episode? This is another exciting thing about EMDR therapy. It's generally very quick, very, very quick. Remember I said with talk therapy can take months, sometimes even years for a person that's struggling with a negative belief about they have about themselves due to past experiences that's happened in their life. It can go on for a long time before they finally start turning around. But in EMDR therapy, sometimes it will take a couple of sessions usually for the therapist to explain the process about EMDR and how it works and what to expect. But then once that processing starts and that bilateral stimulation starts, generally in about 80 to 90% of cases, within just a few sessions, it can be resolved and come to a more adaptive type of thinking of things. Because remember, EMDR is belief focused. You're focusing on that negative belief, that negative perception that they've turned inward that's causing the distress in their life. So saying that, it's not important that they believe totally in the EMDR therapy, that it will work. A lot of times people come in and when they hear about EMDR therapy and, following your finger back and forth, they're skeptical. I was skeptical when I first heard about it as a therapist, thinking how can that really make that much of a difference? But it does, it really does. And so just playing the role of the observer and trusting the process is all that's necessary for EMDR to work. And that's exciting. So that bilateral stimulation is just one component of the EMDR. Remember, you're having them notice things as they go along, notice any other images that come up, notice the beliefs that are attached to those past experiences, noticing the emotions that's coming up, looking for patterns in their behavior that they've had as they're processing it and bringing it up. And since there's been so much research in EMDR therapy over the years, and they've tried it for different types of diagnoses and different types of mental health challenges and issues, there's been a lot of different protocols that's been developed where the protocol's been tweaked here and there for different diagnoses. And so it can be used for just a wide variety of different types of mental health issues. But all the protocols, no matter what the mental health challenge or issue it is that you're using it for, are based on what we call a three-pronged approach. And that's the past, the present, and the future. EMDR therapy involves all of that. You're bringing up past events that are distressing, that continue to distress an individual in the present. You're bringing up how has it affected you in the present, what's going on in the present as a result of that belief that you've carried forward. And remember, I told you we ask, how would you rather feel? And so we're helping them develop some coping skills for the future. And you'll see how that's going to work in just a second here. So we ask them these set of questions as we're going along while we're doing this rapid eye movement or bilateral, it might be tapping. And you're asking them to engage in free association. What's going to come up is other related events that are associated with that same belief system. I say same belief system, the event itself that might come up, those memories that might come up, may be situations that are totally unrelated, a different type of situation than the one that you originally came into treatment for. However, the belief that it caused you to have about yourself is the same. So that's how things are categorized in the brain, not necessarily, for instance, if something bad happened to you at a birthday party, you were embarrassed by something that happened at a birthday party, you may categorize logically in your head, you may think to categorize all the memories that are associated with that would be all birthday parties. But maybe not all birthday parties that you ever attended had something bad similar happen to it. But maybe the person that humiliated you at that birthday party maybe was wearing a yellow dress. And now every time you see something yellow, it makes you think of that event. So that's how the brain categorizes things. Not necessarily the way we would think logically that things would be categorized, but there's a common thread of triggers from one event to the next. Think about this. Have you ever been sitting in a, say you're sitting at a doctor's office and you're waiting to be called back, and you're just sitting there and all of a sudden this random thought just pops into your head, right? I'll use a birthday party again. And you're thinking to yourself, why did I think of that? That's just some random thought. Maybe it happened back when you were like 10 years old. And you wonder to yourself, why did that thought just pop into my head? That's so random. But it's not random. Something in your environment there in that waiting room is present that was present at that birthday party. And your brain connected it. Your brain remembered that. And that's why that memory popped into your head. It might be the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. It might be somebody in a yellow dress sitting in the waiting room. It might be the smell of someone's cologne that was similar to the smell of someone's cologne at that birthday party. So your brain connected those, and that's why that memory popped up. That's what EMDR therapy is based on. And that's what happens when you start stimulating the right and the left brain, and you bring up a distressing event that's related to some belief about yourself, some negative belief. And what happens when you start that bilateral, all those events and memories that come up that is related to that the brain has stored improperly, all come up. So guess what? It has a generalizing effect. So you get that distress score down to a 0 when it's no longer distressing and the person starts working it out. All situations that are similar, that have that same belief system, improve. So it has this effect that you can move forward with. That's another exciting thing about EMDR. So you ask, does it have any adverse effect? Well, you're going to have other memories pop up that might be distressing when you're sitting there in the counseling session, but you're sitting there with a counselor where those can be addressed. And hopefully the counselor is trained to keep you in that window of tolerance. There's different things that you can do as a counselor during that. It's part of the training for EMDR, to keep a person within their window of tolerance so that they don't shut down, or so they don't go into hypoarousal or hyperarousal. So, and it's a very emotional one. So a person may become very emotional during the counseling process because, they're bringing up situations. So some could say that that's, slightly adverse effect, but you're with a counselor and you're working through it. So there are lots of different things that like I said before, that EMDR can be treated for. I put just some of the more common ones that I've seen in my office. This is by no means an exhaustive list of all the different ways that you can use EMDR therapy, but here's some. So it works very well for people who've developed phobias of any kind. It works very well for people with panic disorder, people with grief issues, of course, PTSD and traumatic events, substance use. So it has a lot of different uses. So what are some of the benefits? It's very rapid, like we talked about before. You can get rapid change in a very short period of time. And in today's society, where therapy tends to be like the crisis of the day, people don't stay in therapy for long periods of time anymore. We're very busy people, and so we have a very limited time to work with most individuals. They don't like to stay in therapy for long periods of time, and they shouldn't. They should, get to resolutions as quickly as they can. Another thing that I really like about EMDR therapy that I didn't really mention before is that people don't have to verbalize those gory details. Because remember, the way it works is they're going to have them bring up a distressing memory, something that's distressing them. So it's the memory. They just have to picture it in their head. They don't have to verbalize, and we don't want them to verbalize. There's not a whole lot of verbalizing in EMDR therapy. They're very brief verbalizations in between when you ask them just a brief question and come up with an answer, but they don't go into great detail about the memory that's distressing. That works very well for individuals that had very traumatizing memories, such as sexual abuse, or where they may have been forced to engage in behaviors that are very humiliating to the client. That's going to be very difficult to verbalize. And the worst part of that event could be something that's so embarrassing that they just don't want to tell anybody, not even a counselor, about the details of, and they don't have to. All they have to do is think about it and then follow with the bilateral movements to help them process. What you're questioning them on is what emotions come up, what bodily sensations come up, what beliefs about themselves come up. So that's what they're verbalizing. They don't have to verbalize all those gory details that it's not really necessary for the clinician or the therapist to know about to be able to assist with the healing process. So that's also another thing that's very helpful. The other is, remember we ask about how would you rather feel? And so we work on developing coping skills. So we have them now, after the trauma has been processed, they've got the distress level down. Now we're going to ask them about, okay, let's work on how you would rather feel when you encounter something that's going to remind you of this in the past. How would you like to react in the future? And they play it out again, doing bilateral stimulation. And so what happens in the brain when you do that, now the brain is associating positive ways of reacting with that memory. So now when they're out in the community and they encounter something that will trigger that memory, what's going to come automatically to their brain, to their mind, is how they want to react. And so I've seen people who have anger management problems as a result of things that's happened to them in the past start reacting much differently and thinking through things before reacting, and no longer have problems with anger management. EMDR has been used in Olympic training camps with that very reason. The people imagine them winning in their category, say it's track or swimming or whatever, and they're imagining what they need to do to be able to come in first place while they're engaging in bilateral stimulation. The brain is associating those things that they're processing while both sides of the brain are communicating with each other. Then what happens when they're actually engaged in their race, in their competition, and they see those triggers, which the triggers in those cases would be the audience, the start line, the finish line, the track. What's going to happen is then when they encounter those things that they were imagining that they needed to do to succeed is going to come to their mind. It's going to come to that frontal cortex. And it's like having a little coach on your shoulder. And so it's been used for performance enhancement. So by the same token, you can use EMDR therapy to dissociate negative associations with memories, or you can associate positive things. So we use it both ways. So if you're interested in getting trained, here's a couple of websites that you can go to. These are the two, Emdr, which stands for EMDR International Association, is the parent company for the training for EMDR therapy. If you're a therapist, they do have to be licensed to be able, or be a licensure intern to be able to receive the training and complete the training. It's a 40-hour class time. Nowadays, we do it online and we do them in person. It's best to be able to do it in person if possible. But since the pandemic, we've really been doing, online trainings also. After the 40 hours of your in-person, that includes learning about the process, learning how to, the protocols that you would need to use, and it's a practicum at the same time. So you're in class, you're learning, and then you're going practicum and you're practicing with a partner. And then you go back to class and you learn the next step and you go back to your practicum and you practice it. So that's the main company, but Emdr Consulting is another training company. They specialize a lot with nonprofits and offer a discount for nonprofits. So if you are associated with a nonprofit, you can get a discount through Emdr Consulting. So I would suggest that maybe you try that. But either one of these are both training organizations. EMDR Consulting is under the umbrella of Emdr. So if you want to take that down.
Donna, we have a quick question. Is there any
Sure.
training for therapist who isn't licensed, for a therapist who isn't licensed?
No, because of the protocols and because of dealing with situations that can cause ab reactions, and it's a strong emotional and trying to keep the people in their window of tolerance and being able to do that. They restrict it to individuals who are at that level of either licensed or are a licensure intern. And they do require that you turn in your license number before you can be trained.
Thank you.
But then after the training is over, as I know, EMDR Consulting makes it a part of their training. And Emdr have just started including that in the price of the training. You have to have 10 hours of consultation time with an approved consultant to staff cases to make sure that you're able to follow the protocol and have fidelity to the model and understand how to utilize it. With EMDR Consulting, you can use any of the therapists that have been approved as trainers or consultants. With Emdr, the way that they do theirs, they are starting to be competitive. They're starting to include the consultation hours with the training, but you have to get the consultation hours through the actual trainer that you did the training with. With EMDR Consulting, you have a little more flexibility. You can get training from one person, but you can get your consultation with any of the consultants that they have listed with their agency. So they both provide the training, they both provide the consultation. And then afterwards, if you decided you wanted to become even further trained and become certified in EMDR, then there's another process where you can become certified, which would involve additional hours of consultation. But those are the two websites that you can get information at. And Jessica, do we have enough time? I have a little 4-minute brief session that they could watch. This is one that Roy Kiesling has given me permission to use in my trainings. He is the founder of EMDR Consulting, Inc., which was this one up here. And this is a video of him working. What he would do is when he would do his trainings, so his audience would be therapists, he would do demonstrations as part of the training. And he would always ask for volunteers. Would anybody want to volunteer? So this is actually the client is actually a therapist, and he's given a demonstration to a class during a training. So, but it gives you an idea of what an EMDR session would look like. It's about 4 minutes. Do we have
over our time, Donna, but I told anyone who needed to jump off that we would send them this. So anybody who can stay, obviously you're welcome to play the video for them.
Okay, you ready? Well,
you may have to hover over it a minute. Sometimes with YouTube videos, it takes a second if it's embedded. It's
embedded. I did not have trouble with it before. I wonder if do I have to take it out of presentation mode?
Normally it should work. Sometimes you literally have to stay hovered over the slide and then the little play button will come up. No.
Well,
we can always send it out as a link if we need.
Yes, when we send it out as a link, you should be able to play it.
Okay.
Which is, okay. Well, is there any other questions that I can answer? Thank you for your time. I hope I know it's a lot of information. I was trying to go through it as quickly as I could to make sure I answered all of the questions that were sent in to me. Thank you everyone for sending in your questions. I was trying to cover all of them in the amount of time that we had today. So I know I went pretty quickly, but I'm open to any questions if anybody has any questions.
And if there's any questions you think of later when we send out the recording, you're welcome to hit reply and we can connect you with Donna. You see her contact information is up there, and I dropped it in the chat earlier because someone asked. I don't know if you mentioned this, Donna, but we do have a lot of trained therapists. So if you're local and you're interested in being an actual client and receiving EMDR, we do have a lot of our therapists who are trained in this. So we can definitely provide that information in the wrap up as well. Because I know we had kind of a blended audience today of therapists themselves, as well as some clients, you know, seeking the services. So perfect. Well, I think that's it. Thank you all, everyone. Again, if you have any other questions for Donna, feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll get the recording out to you soon. Thank you.